In 2003, a doctor told Steve Jobs he had a curable form of pancreatic cancer. Steve Jobs, the man who had bent reality his entire life, decided he didn't want surgery. For 9 months, he refused the operation. He tried juices, acupuncture, herbs, spiritualists. By the time he finally agreed to go under the knife, the cancer had spread. His wife Laureen later said it was the decision she most wished she could undo. And here's what makes that so heartbreaking. This was a man who had already cheated death once before, who had been abandoned at birth, dropped out of college, built a billion-dollar company from a garage, been thrown out of his own company at 30, and came back a decade later to save it and turn it into the most valuable corporation on earth. Steve Jobs did not play by anyone else's rules. Not society's, not nature's, and apparently not medicine's. This is his story, and it is one of the most extraordinary lives ever lived. Steve Jobs was born on February 24th, 1955, and immediately given away. His biological parents were Joanne Stiebel, a young graduate student from Wisconsin, and Abdul Fattah Jandali, a Syrian Muslim teaching assistant. Her father disapproved of the relationship, and unmarried motherhood was an option. So Joanne traveled to San Francisco, gave birth quietly, and arranged for a closed adoption. Her only condition? The baby must go to college graduates. But the lawyer and his wife, who were supposed to adopt the boy, backed out at the last minute. They wanted a girl. So baby Stephen ended up with Paul and Clara Jobs, a high school dropout who fixed cars for a living and his salt-of-the-earth wife. Joanne initially refused to sign the adoption papers. She only agreed after Paul and Clara signed a pledge promising to fund their new son's college education. From his very first breath, Steve Jobs was shaped by abandonment and reinvention. He would later recall sitting on his front lawn as a 6-year-old and telling the girl next door he was adopted. She asked, "Does that mean your real parents didn't want you?" Lightning bolts went off in his head. He ran home crying. His parents sat him down and said something that would echo through his entire life. "We specifically picked you out." They said it slowly. They emphasized every word. Abandoned, chosen, special. These 3 ideas became the foundation of Steve Jobs' psychology, and also, some argued, his greatest flaws. Paul Jobs gave his son a workbench in the garage and taught him something crucial. Even the parts no one could see should be crafted perfectly. When he built a fence, he made sure the back was as clean as the front. He loved doing things right, Steve said. It was a lesson that would later define every Apple product. Growing up in the Santa Clara Valley, soon to be nicknamed Silicon Valley, young Steve discovered electronics through his neighbors. One of them was an engineer at Hewlett-Packard who showed him things called transistors. Steve was electrified. At age 12, he actually picked up the phone book, found Bill Hewlett's home number, called him directly, and asked for spare parts. Hewlett was so impressed, he gave Steve a summer job. The kid had zero fear of authority. That would never change. In high school, Steve Jobs met Steve Wozniak, and it was one of the great partnerships in history, a perfect collision between artistic vision and technical genius. Woz was 5 years older, enormously talented, and practically incapable of self-promotion. Jobs was the opposite. He couldn't write much code, but he could see the future. Together, they first built a little blue box, an illegal device that could hack into AT&T's phone network and make free long-distance calls. Jobs immediately saw it as a business. He sold them door to door in college dorms. One of their calls accidentally reached the Vatican. Jobs tried to get the Pope on the line, pretending to be Henry Kissinger. This was Steve Jobs at 19. After a stint at Reed College in Portland, where he dropped out but hung around for 18 months, sleeping on friends' floors and auditing classes he actually wanted to take, including one on calligraphy, Jobs drifted to India in search of spiritual enlightenment. He came back with a shaved head, a deep interest in Zen Buddhism, and a lifelong belief in intuition over analysis. Then came Atari, then came Wozniak's breakthrough circuit board, and then came Apple. It started literally in a garage in Los Altos in 1976. Wozniak had designed a machine for his own pleasure. He never imagined selling it. Jobs saw its potential instantly. He handled the business side, got their first order from a local computer shop, and incorporated Apple Computer Company in 1977, valued at $5,309. Less than 4 years later, Apple went public. Steve Jobs, age 25, was worth $256 million. 300 people became millionaires that day. One man Jobs had known since college, Daniel Kottke, one of his closest friends, was deliberately cut out. When a colleague offered to match Jobs dollar for dollar if Jobs gave Kottke some options, Jobs replied, "Okay, I will give him zero." Brilliance and cruelty wrapped in the same person. This tension would never resolve. The story of the Macintosh begins with a field trip. In 1979, Jobs finagled a visit to Xerox's research lab, called Park. What he saw there changed everything. Computers with graphical interfaces, with windows, icons, a mouse. It was the future, and Xerox had no idea what to do with it. Jobs did. He went back to Apple and flipped the entire Lisa project upside down. His engineers thought he was insane. His engineers were wrong. But Jobs wasn't easy to work for. Colleagues described what they called the reality distortion field, a phenomenon where Jobs would declare something impossible and then, through sheer force of will, personality, and relentlessness, make people accomplish it anyway. Deadlines that engineers said required years were completed in months. Features that couldn't be done got done. His expectations bent reality. The flip side? He was brutal. He would walk through the office and call people's work shit to their faces. He had two categories for everything: genius or bozo. Products were either the best thing ever made or a piece of crap. There was no middle ground. The 1984 Macintosh launch is still considered one of the greatest product introductions in history. The iconic Super Bowl commercial, directed by Ridley Scott, showed a dystopian IBM-dominated world being shattered by a woman throwing a hammer. 1 minute, never aired again, still talked about 40 years later. Jobs wept when the Mac team finally shipped. But success brought chaos. Sales slumped after the initial excitement. Jobs fought with Apple's CEO, John Sculley, the man he had personally recruited from Pepsi with the famous line, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world?" The relationship curdled. Jobs tried to stage a coup to oust Sculley. Sculley found out and called Jobs' bluff in a boardroom showdown, polling the entire executive team. "It's me or Steve. Who do you vote for?" Jobs lost. Every single person chose Sculley. In 1985, Steve Jobs, age 30, was stripped of all authority and exiled from the company he had founded. He went home and cried. Being fired turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to him. Jobs said so himself. He launched a new computer company called Next, determined to build the most sophisticated workstation ever made. The Next Cube was gorgeous. It was also wildly overpriced and a commercial failure. But the operating system Jobs built for it, that would eventually become the foundation of every Apple product made after his return. Meanwhile, Jobs had bought a little animation division from George Lucas for $5 million. He named it Pixar. For years, Pixar lost money. Jobs poured in tens of millions of his own fortune, keeping it alive. But then something magical happened. Toy Story, the first fully computer-animated feature film, hit theaters in 1995 and became the highest-grossing film of the year. Suddenly, Jobs owned a studio worth billions. His personal life was messy. He had denied paternity of his daughter Lisa for years, leaving her mother, Kristen Brennan, to raise her on welfare. He eventually took responsibility, grew closer to Lisa, and later described his treatment of her as one of his greatest regrets. He also fell in love with Laureen Powell, a Stanford MBA student who famously crashed a lecture where Jobs was speaking. They married. They built a family. Friends described Laureen as the gravitational center who kept Jobs tethered to humanity. He also discovered he had a biological sister, the celebrated novelist Mona Simpson. They became close. When Jobs was dying, she was at his bedside. By 1996, Apple was hemorrhaging money. It had tried every CEO, every strategy. Nothing worked. In desperation, they bought Next and got Steve Jobs back in the bargain. He walked back into Apple and found a company making dozens of mediocre products, drowning in complexity. Within weeks, he drew a simple 2x2 grid on a whiteboard. Consumer, professional, desktop, portable. For products. Everything else gets canceled. The room was stunned. Jobs was merciless. Then came the advertising campaign that signaled Apple's rebirth. Think Different, a montage of the greatest rebels in history. Einstein, Gandhi, Picasso, Amelia Earhart, Martin Luther King Jr. The voiceover declared, "The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." Jobs cried in the meeting where his agency pitched it. Then came the iMac, a translucent, candy-colored, all-in-one computer that looked like nothing anyone had ever seen. The design came from Johnny Ive, a young British designer who would become Jobs' closest collaborator and creative partner. Their relationship was the most productive friendship in the history of industrial design. Apple was back. Jobs' insight in the early 2000s was that the personal computer was about to become the hub of a digital lifestyle, managing your music, photos, videos, all of it. Music was first. When Napster was reshaping the industry and teenagers were burning CDs by the millions, Jobs saw an opportunity. He built iTunes, a dead simple music manager for the Mac. Then he went further. In February 2001, Apple's hardware chief John Rubinstein visited a Toshiba factory in Japan and saw a tiny 1.8-inch hard drive they'd invented and didn't know what to do with. He called Jobs that night. "I know how to do it. I just need a $10 million check." Jobs authorized it immediately. 10 months later, Jobs unveiled the iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket. 2 years after that, he launched the iTunes Store and convinced every major music label to sell individual songs for 99 cents each. The music industry thought he was crazy. Within 3 years, iTunes was the largest music retailer on earth. Steve Jobs had saved the music industry and made Apple into something far more than a computer company. At the 2007 Macworld, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage and said, "Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything." Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone. The iPhone was 3 years in the making, built in complete secrecy. Jobs had started it after watching one of his engineers use a prototype tablet and realizing that touchscreen technology could transform mobile phones first. His demands were impossible. The phone had to have no physical buttons. It had to have a screen that could sense multiple fingers simultaneously. It had to run a real computer operating system. And it had to be beautiful. Every engineer said it couldn't be done. Every engineer was wrong. When the iPhone launched, it obliterated every competitor. Nokia, BlackBerry, Motorola, all suddenly looked like relics. Within a few years, Apple had captured the majority of profits in the entire global smartphone industry. Then came the App Store, which Jobs initially opposed. He didn't want outside developers on his device. He changed his mind, and what followed was nothing less than a new economy. Millions of apps, billions of dollars, entire industries born on a glass rectangle. Then came the iPad, a device the tech press mocked as just a big iPod Touch. It created the tablet computing industry and transformed publishing, education, and media. Through all of this, Jobs was fighting cancer. The pancreatic tumor had first been discovered in 2003. His 9-month delay in seeking treatment was the decision that haunted everyone around him. When he finally had surgery in 2004, it appeared successful. But the cancer came back. Then came a liver transplant in 2009. Jobs flew to Tennessee, where wait times were shorter, and got a new liver. Even dying, Jobs was gaming systems. He took 3 medical leaves from Apple. Each return was a miracle of will. Even in the final months, he was working on new product designs, planning a new Apple campus shaped like a spaceship, and dictating the principles he wanted the company to hold after he was gone. Steve Jobs died on October 5th, 2011. He was 56. His sister Mona Simpson delivered a eulogy that included his final words. As his family gathered around him, he looked at his sister, then his children, then his life partner. And then he looked past them, at something no one else could see. His last words were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." Walter Isaacson spent 2 years interviewing Steve Jobs and everyone who knew him. What emerged was not a saint, not a monster, something rarer, a complete human being with gifts and flaws so extreme they were almost mythological. Jobs revolutionized 7 industries in one lifetime. He was also, at times, cruel to the people who loved him. He abandoned his daughter. He stole credit. He screamed at subordinates. He ignored medical advice that might have saved his life. And yet, the products he made feel human in a way most technology never has. Because Jobs believed that technology should be infused with the humanities, that the best engineers were like poets. That beauty was not a luxury, it was a necessity. His final words to Isaacson were a challenge to all of us. You always have to keep pushing to innovate. Dylan could have sung protest songs forever. The Beatles could have kept doing what worked, but they kept moving. Otherwise, as Dylan says, if you're not busy being born, you're busy dying. Steve Jobs was always busy being born. If this video added something to your day, hit subscribe because we do this for every great book. And drop in the comments, what's the one Jobs lesson that hit you hardest? See you in the next one.